I worked in ONS for a lot of my career, and within ONS I worked on economic statistics, so economic topics, and like looking at the labour market, the GDP, international trade and productivity. So this book was really great because it comes at things from a macroeconomic perspective, whereas quite a lot of literature is much more at the micro. So it was really nice to have something that was sort of more related to my area of expertise. Also, I did work on productivity for a while, and the UK is in this long period since the financial crisis in 2008 of a real stagnation in productivity growth. So is there anything that we can learn from the past? Throughout my career, I've had less dealings with looking at women, or because I tend to talk in aggregate terms or think about the household as a whole rather than individuals within the household. But actually, this book highlights some of the important factors that may be hidden when you just talk about things as a household, and not really taking into account how those things might differ. Like others, I've become very aware of the fact that women do the majority of the unpaid work that doesn't contribute to sort of traditional GDP economic growth. So it sits outside that traditional framework for growth. And really important that when our policy makers are making decisions, they're making the right decisions. And as an operational researcher, I'm all about ensuring that people have the right evidence to make those right decisions. So that involves taking a look across sex and gender as well. And finally, just because Victoria Bateman gave such a good presentation when I saw her, it prompted me to sort of think that actually, yeah, this book's one that I wanted to actually go out and read. So a little bit about Victoria, and Victoria, feel free to come in or not come in, I don't mind either way. But Victoria Bateman, she's a fellow and lecturer at Cambridge University. She is an economist and a feminist. She grew up in Oldham, which was part of the Centre for Textile, the textile industry as part of the Industrial Revolution. And she's grown up with from a history of strong women, but also experienced financial hardship when her family's business has experienced booms and bust. And she's well known for using her body as well as her words when talking about women's rights and important issues. And the picture there is one that I took when she gave a presentation to us at ONS. But Victoria is not. She uses her platform and uses her body where necessary, but not in every case to make that statement. Victoria, is there anything you want to add before I go on?
No, I think that's such a lovely summary. Thank you. Thank you.
No problem,
and it was a real pleasure to be able to talk to you. It seems a long time ago now, doesn't it? 2018. But
exactly,
I'm not sure much has improved since. But
so exactly. Thank you. That's great. So I pulled out some key themes from the book. Clearly, this is a book discussion, so I'm not an expert on the book. I'm not an expert on economics. So I've talked very sort of generally about some of the key things that I think that are important here, and we can use these as a basis for our first breakout discussion. So, so the important lessons that Victoria lays out in the book. So first of all, that sex and gender are largely ignored in the theory of economic growth, and that the women's participation in the labour market has been essential for economic development, and countries in the West which adopted this principle early on have had stronger economic growth. It's also, in economics, there's a simplification that has to be made and a generalization when they talk about seeing people as individuals that are independent, self-interested and rational when they make decisions. However, that is obviously not always the case, and particularly when you talk about women, they may not be able to act independently, they may not have that agency, to make those sort of decisions that are in their interest. The family structures have changed. So we've moved in the UK, particularly, we've moved away from a more extended family model to a more sort of what we call a nuclear family. That means that women have had more chance to engage outside of the family, and it's also meant that you couldn't rely on perhaps the wife of the family to do all the care for the extended family, and how that has impacted on the way the economies have grown. Women's freedom is essential to what made the West rich, and by women's freedom, it's women's freedom over their bodies, so their fertility, and also freedom with the finances, so either having their own money or having access to the household finances, and also in terms of voting and being able to influence at a political level on how decisions are made. And then there's a role of women. It applies both in the free market but also the welfare state, and those things have been very much influenced by women. So, Victoria, did you want to come in?
Oh, I guess the first question that really drove me as an economist, and as you say, Catherine, I mean, looking back at my kind of early experiences as a teenager in Oldham, is the question of why are some countries rich and others poor? And the way I came to answer that was through economic history, to think about how did the West grow rich? How did this tiny little island on the edge of Europe go from being a backwater to global civilization to being the richest economy in the world in the 19th century? And when I took to the economic history books to find the answers very much revolved around men. So it was kind of famous male scientists of the 18th and 19th century, famous male industrialists, cotton mill owners, steel firm owners, and so on, merchants, obviously male merchants, and so on. And yet, when I looked at what was going on in Britain historically in terms of merchant activity, market activity, trade, and so on, it really wasn't all that different to what was going on, say, in China or India or the Middle East. There was a great deal of all that activity going on, going back millennia, actually. And so, I realized that if we're trying to look for something that was, different about Britain, Europe more generally, that allowed it to not just catch up, but overtake parts of the world that had been leading the global economy for millennia, China, India, Middle East, that the difference was in women's lives, not in men's lives, that was where the biggest difference lay. And I think it's not very well known that actually until the 19th century, women were really active in the British economy. It was normal for women to go out to work. And you worked from, your teenage years onwards, whether it was in agriculture, whether it was in domestic service, and then later on in, manufacturing, cotton mills, and so on. And, so women were actually out there working. They weren't being married off at a young age. They had their own financial independence from a young age. And as you say, Catherine, what I argue in the book is that was key then to laying the foundations, laying the seeds of growth, because you have these financially independent young women. The result of that is actually some of them choose not to get married at all, don't go on to get married and have children. Those that do so at a remarkably modern age, in their mid-20s. So we know from church records from the 1500s, right the way through to the early 1800s, the average age that women got married in Britain was about 25, which is, compared with the average age of marriage at that time in, say, China, the Middle East, and India, where it was closer to 18 or less. And with that, you have these smaller, much more nuclear families developing. And with that, you have families that are better resourced. They have fewer mouths to feed. You've got that background to both the, not just the husbands being in work, but the wives being in work. So you've got these smaller, more nuclear families. better resourced, so better able to afford to save, to be able to apprentice their children so that their children can skill up. And because there is less population pressure as a result of these smaller families, you have a relatively high wage economy compared with, for example, China, India, the Middle East at the time. And those high wages, which further support the kind of development of saving and investment at the household level and skill acquisition, that those high wages also incentivize technological improvement, because businesses can't just rely on cheap labor to get by. You know, labor is quite expensive, and so they have to develop technologies, invest in capital. And so you get into this kind of virtuous circle between high wages and a high productivity economy in which they feed back to support each other. But I think the real irony then is, as I go on to explore in the book, whilst women's freedom provided these foundations for saving and investment, skills, technology, the irony is that women weren't paid back for all that effort. So during the Industrial Revolution itself in the 19th century, women's labour force participation actually fell. And so we're coming out of the Industrial Revolution with fewer women working than went into the Industrial Revolution. And during the Industrial Revolution, population booms. And so women are, they're in a sense forced out of the labour force. They're in the home with more children to look after. And that's when this, the male breadwinner model really starts to develop, something that we assume is much, much deeper rooted, but actually is a product of the 19th century. And at that point, that's a really interesting point, because that's when modern economics is developing. It's developing against this backdrop in which you have this increasingly gendered economy where you have, the marketplace is increasingly seen as male, and that's the hub of rationality, calculation, self-interest, and the home is increasingly seen as female. And that's where you have the self-sacrifice that goes on. That's where you have what's seen as the moral backbone to the economy, where you have, the dependency, the care, and the reproductive labor that goes on. And so that domestic sphere becomes seen as very female, and the market becomes seen as very male. That's the backdrop against which modern economics is developing. So not a very good time for economists to be starting making their models about the world. And with it, economists adopt this wall between those two spheres, between the market, the kind of public sphere, and the private sphere. And as a result, things like reproductive and caring labor become left out of economic models when it comes to the contribution that those are making. We have, people like Marshall, who argues in his book that economics is a subject not suited to women. When we're talking about the economy, we're talking about this very male market, private sector sphere, and women are kind of separate to that. And we have Edgeworth, one of the biggest economists in the late 19th, early 20th century, arguing against the idea of equal pay for equal work, because at the time you had the suffragettes arguing for equal pay for equal work. But what Edgeworth does is to use the idea of negative externalities against women. So he argues that if women are paid equally for the work they're doing in the marketplace, then they'll come out of the home, they'll enter the marketplace, they'll start working, and then we won't have all of this caring labor going on behind the scenes, and that will be bad for children and it will be bad for men. So if women work, he argues, it will create this negative externality for everyone else in the economy. And so we should try and work against the idea of equal pay, that the gender pay gap is actually a good thing because it's helping to correct this negative externality that would otherwise arise from women's work. So we end up with quite perverse arguments being made that really don't help the cause of women's rights, that don't help us to, in a sense, get back to where we were before the Industrial Revolution, which was, in a sense, a much more equal world.
Really, Victoria, that's absolutely fascinating, and thank you for articulating that so well about, you know, where we are now in very recent history and those sorts of almost things that we're sort of battling against when we're trying to get into this marketplace. So hopefully everyone, we're going to move into some breakout sessions, and hopefully that's, even if you haven't read the book, that Victoria's given you a lot of things to discuss about whether actually some of those things you ring true. I also thought that we should cover like our culture and background, and whether any of this stuff does sort of sound familiar to the way we work or the way that our our family structure works. Really like to hear about, you know, anything that people don't agree with, because, you know, this is, like I said, safe space. So if there's anything that you don't agree with, or that you're really sort of questioning a bit more about that whole thing about, you know, perhaps is, you know, should there be more of a reward and more of an incentive for women to stay at home, you know, if the care was provided within the sort of brought into the sort of the GDP model of economic growth, would that be a good point? Or any other sort of thoughts that people have on the book, and why they like it, and why they would want to go away and read it. So Steve, you're gonna, I think we probably get away with 2 rooms, do you think? And if we just do sort of 10 minutes, and give people a chance to, obviously, as well in the breakout room, as well as chat it, like, I want you to chat about the book, but also sort of introduce yourselves, and so we can all sort of get to know each other as well as chatting about the book, and where people work and things like that. So 10 minutes should be plenty time for this session.
The Enlightenment idea, so the idea that we became a more enlightened, a more scientifically minded economy, society, that we shifted from seeing the world as being driven by fate, magic, and heavenly forces to seeing it as driven by the laws of science, and that therefore intellectuals began a process of uncovering the laws of science and then harnessing that in a way that helped the economy, in a way that became embedded in new machines, new technologies, and that once you have that scientific basis for your economy, you have the potential for long run growth, because you kind of never lose that scientific drive and that continued improvement in technology. But then the kind of competing theory is that science and scientific change isn't enough by itself, because it can just stay in the ivory towers, that for businesses on the ground to actually make use of new ideas, new technologies, factor prices need to be right. So you've got to think about the cost of labor, of using a kind of cheap labor method versus using machines. And so the second theory argues that it is because Britain, and it's kind of Northwestern Europe in general, so this included kind of Belgium and Netherlands, because that was quite a high wage economy, that you have that combination of the new, more scientific basis for the economy, but also high wages that mean that businesses are actually interested in using scientific ideas to improve the production process. And then something else that you kind of have 3 parties coming together. You've got your scientists, you've got your businesses that are interested in making a profit, so using scientific ideas, and then you have skilled workers that can actually turn abstract scientific ideas into machines that entrepreneurs can use. So they're coming together of 3 groups: the scientists, the entrepreneurs, and the skilled workers. Like clockmakers, for example, were amazingly helpful in the Industrial Revolution because they understood mechanics. And so they can, you can go from making a clock to making a big piece of cotton machinery, for example, to create mass production. So those are the kind of 2 big competing theories. And what I argue in my book, Sex Factor, is that they, in a sense, ignore what was going on the ground, that actually, where did that high wage economy come from? And where did those skilled workers come from? And I argue that that is the fact that you're in an economy, a part of the world where women had relatively a lot of freedom, and that therefore created these, smaller families, that meant in turn a higher wage economy and families that could better afford to apprentice their children. So hence you had more clockmakers, for example, in your economy, as opposed to just lots and lots of cheap, unskilled labor. So that's, yeah, I mean, it's ever developing, the causes of the Industrial Revolution. And if we can kind of find the right answer to what caused the Industrial Revolution, we could roll it out and, rescue millions from poverty across the world today type thing, which sounds very economic imperialism. But yeah, I mean, it's once you start thinking about it, it's difficult to think about anything else, really.
Fascinating. Thank you.
Great, we're all back. We caught the end of that discussion about wages. Excellent. Any reflections? I've talked to with my group. We ended up just basically talking more about where we were working, finding out that where we're based around the world, and seeing where there were synergies of how we can work together. Megan, Jeremy, anything you wanted to come in on just to reflect back to the group?
Go ahead, Jeremy.
No, Megan, you please go ahead on me.
Well, let's see. We had, I'm trying to remember who else was in the group. We were talking about our experiences in the professional realm, and I came to it with children. And who else was in our group? I didn't, was it Linda?
Was it Louise?
Louise, there we go. And Louise entered it without children, right? And just talking about how my entrance was majorly delayed. Not that was my focus in life, but I definitely had to wait until the kids were graduated from high school, as opposed to Louise, who had more of a freedom, with just accounting for her partner, as opposed to, a larger family independence. And that how those roles, generally do fall on gendered lines. Not that they always do, but, they especially do. And I'm in Gen X, like my generation and older, that's absolutely where the gender lines were. You really didn't find stay-at-home dads, But then there's also just the physical part of it. Like I'm the only one who could have a kid. So in the partnership, so I had to take time out, period, for things like that. But then Jeremy and I and Louise, we were talking about how we're kind of in the same fields of scenario planning. And so we all have these very different efforts trying to diversify the dialogues that are going on now that are dominating and will dominate the design of our shared futures, whereas historically has been largely a Western male narrative in the field. So that's it. That's what we're talking about.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Megan, for giving us that summary. From the other group, Sonia, any reflections?
It's really interesting. We had the privilege of having Victoria in our group, and she's telling us a little bit about her new book as well as Sex Factor. So looking at kind of how some of the societies, both in the past but also currently, like in Afghanistan and stuff, are sort of actually taking women out of the workforce, and the cause of that around, I can't remember what you called it, the
Cult of female modesty.
Cult of female modesty, that was it. And how that's even in our society is still to some extent kind of present. So yeah, really interesting.
Great. No, thank you. That sounds great. Okay, we haven't got, as expected, with these things, we never have enough time to discuss everything. But I will share my screen again. I had some other sort of core questions, but we'll probably discuss maybe just like one thing together as a group. And I'm totally up for discussing something else. So can you see that I've added some big questions? So I had, to what extent do women have full agency, as in do they, we're saying like in the UK, perhaps, that we can say a lot of the pushback I get when I talk about gender equality is the fact that people say, oh, well, there's no difference, women have got equality, and actually there's quite a lot where we haven't, and it's sort of things like light bulb moment. Oh yeah, that's true. Yeah, you don't have that, you can't do that. So wondering if anyone had any views on that. That's probably a good place to start. So one of the things, and it may sort of go into sort of politics, but one of the things that I've been particularly worried about recently internationally is the change to the abortion laws in America, and that's like to me that seems like quite a backwards step for there, and doesn't look like anything like that's happening in the UK, which is reassuring. But even the fact that those decisions are happening is worrying. Not even the decision, it's just the fact that they've got the political or the structure that allows for us to take people in those directions is worrying.
Yeah,
Does anyone have any thoughts?
Well, I mean, one of the things I argue in my new book is that there is generally this puritanical revival underway right now. And, I look back across the whole of history and these swings between periods of sexual revolution and then periods of puritanism, across thousands of years of history, you see this pendulum swinging, and the Puritans are never that far away. And what you have in America is this rather purity culture of, virginity pledges, modesty ponchos, chastity balls, that's been bubbling away under the surface for the last 20 years or so. And it's the same kind of groups that are pushing for those movements that are also pushing the anti-abortion agenda. And it is very much driven by this view that unless we crack down on women's sexuality, America would become a nation of harlots. So, that women, if they have access to birth control, if they have access to abortion, they're going to be out having lots of sex rampantly, and this will turn them into, little harlots, and that this will be bad for society, bad for them and bad for society. And so we need to encourage women to be more chaste, to be, doing their more traditional roles within the home, and that this will bring greater social stability. And I think what's particularly worrying, though, is you kind of expect this from some of the religious zealots that are driving these movements in the deep south of America. But what has really surprised me is actually the number of feminists that are adopting this type of puritanical view. So you have, in the US, you have quite a famous book there, Wendy Shalit's A Return to Modesty, that argues that if only women could become more modest, return to the modest past, then we could command more respect, and then we could solve the problem of sexism. And I think that kind of places the blame on women. She argues that women are we're too easy when it comes to sex, and we're too immodest in our dress, and it's no wonder therefore that we're treated badly, that we're treated like sex objects because we behave like sex objects. And I think that's a really screwed up way of thinking, that women's bodies are the problem rather than attitudes. And I think what's worrying is you're getting more and more feminist books like that. So there was one published just last year, actually by my publishers, Louise Perry's book, which looks at what she sees as the downsides of the sexual revolution for women, which again encourages women to be more modest in their sexual lives and in their state of dress, in an effort to command more respect. So that kind of same puritanism that we've seen in Iran since 1979, the revolution there, the idea of if women uncover their hair, they're inciting prostitution, they'll turn Iran into a nation of harlots. And that we see in Afghanistan with women being pulled out of the workplace and schools. We also see that, as you say, in America, driving that anti-abortion movement, also at the same time driving a kind of anti-porn, anti-sex worker movement as well, which is getting a kind of even more support really than the anti-abortion side of things. But I mean, you raise a really interesting question, Catherine, about to what extent will we copy America and go the same way? And one of the things we were talking about in our breakout group was girls at schools up and down this country, if they turn up in the morning and they're not dressing sufficiently modestly, then they can be sent home for being too tempting to the male teachers and to the boys in the classroom. So, you know, how far are we away from that type of Puritanism? Perhaps it's all too close.
Brilliant. Thank you for those reflections. Jeremy, you patiently had your hand up. Did you have something to add?
I did a little bit, but Megan had her hand up before me, so I defer to Megan first.
Megan and then Jeremy.
I was just one of the conversations that keeps coming up, like pretty much across my lifetime, because there's been a lot of big global things I think that have happened, and then just local, like national things, is I can't believe this is happening again. And I do appreciate your comment, Victoria, and the awareness of how cyclical we are as societies and as cultures. But when it comes to women's agency, and we talk about the US, I think it's really, really important in spaces like that, not just the US, that we understand we're talking about largely the white population, because the Native Americans have never, and I mean, I'm grouping a few different cultures in there, and just to label Native American, this is not a thing with them, and this has been forced on them. Same thing when you look at a lot of the other cultures that mix in the UK is similar in that, and other EU countries where you have a lot of other populations that are significant proportions of the local population. It's like these issues we need to understand are still, they're not all pervasive. And yeah, when we're talking about like US conservatism, we're talking about a white Christian conservatism. It's in there, the word's in there somewhere. But yeah, and then to think of like the First Nation people, not a thing. It's just a completely different ballgame altogether. And that's the same thing when we look at Australia and their extremely strict laws. That's not necessarily a native issue or a Maori issue or any other things like that. So, but I appreciate the cyclical thing, because same thing, we had the Great Revival. I'm sure you came across that, and the UK had like Oliver Cromwell, and we've get these cycles. So I just hate that we're in this one.
Thanks, Megan. Really important point there about it being a subset of the population in America. That's really fun. Jeremy, we'll let you come in.
Yeah, just building on some of the things that have already been said. I mean, one of the several things I'm involved with, I'm on the President's Council of an NGO called Pathfinder International, which is working and dedicated to reproductive and sexual health around the world. And with a women's empowerment aspect behind that. And first of all, there's all these terrible currents that have been mentioned around that. And in fact, the Supreme Court in the US sent out ripples which have been picked up to justify things further. But wherever there's a current, there's a countercurrent. So one of the things that I learned in speaking to a deep analyst of voting patterns in the US, you'll recall that at the recent midterm elections, the Democratic Party did much better than was expected beforehand. And that has been found to have been largely due to new votes emerging from people who are opposed to what had happened with Roe versus Wade. And so again, maybe emphasizes something of these systems aspects we talk about, where there are strong currents and also countercurrents that get generated from them. So a little bit of a systems thinking perspective on that.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jeremy. Because my final section was going to be talking more from an OR perspective around that, and making sure that all of our systems thinking models we are breaking down by sex, gender, and it was just really a sort of reminder of that. But I don't think the audience here needs reminding of that, because I think all your work is relevant, and in those areas is already taking into account those all those different voices. So thank you for that. So I will just like to say, first of all, thank you so much to Victoria for joining us. vastly enriched the discussion having you here. And it's such an honor to sort of hear it directly from you rather than, you know, you speaking directly rather than just having to read the words on the page. I would, Steve has been a great co-host, and I know that he's got a feedback form, which it would be grateful if people could fill in. And also, as a reminder, we've got these sessions coming up. The next one's on the 18th of May. And if you're not part of WORAN, you can sign up to then you'll get the invite, so you'll know when our next events are happening. Just want to thank Caitlin and Karen as well for setting up all the breakout rooms and everything. And thanks to everyone for attending.
And I'd just like to thank, I guess, Catherine for running this event. So again, thanks for organising that. So.
No problem. No, I enjoyed it, and I hope anyone who hasn't read the book will now go away and read it. And also, Victoria's mentioned she's got a new book, so I haven't read that yet. So we will look out for that and read that too. So thank you so much to everyone for coming.
Thank you. That's great.
Cheers all.